Welcome, everyone. I'm Matt O'Hara. I'm the chair of the history department, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to our undergraduate spring showcase. It's a chance when we get to show off really the best of our undergraduate research. And as I talked a little bit about last year at this event, it's a chance when the department, which is often spread out in different offices and classrooms and students doing their work, gets to come together as a kind of community. And what got me thinking about that again this year was there's a part of books that professors, I think if you ask them in the heart of hearts what they most enjoy reading in a monograph, it's often the acknowledgments. And there might be a reason for that, because in grad school, often our professors try to pretend that we can read a list of books that's like this big. We pretend to read them, and one of the ways that we pretend to read them is by looking deeply at the acknowledgments, because it's amazing how deep a sense of the product you can get from those 2 or 3 pages. And so today I want to acknowledge the people who made today possible and help us come together as a community. One sitting right in front of me, Stephanie Sawyer, our undergraduate coordinator extraordinaire, who really makes so many connections happen between undergraduate researchers and faculty. So I want to say thank you, Stephanie, very much. I want to say thank you to the rest of our department staff, Stephanie Hinkle, who's in the back, our department manager, Rose Greenberg, who has really, if anyone made this particular event happen, it's probably Rose, so thank you, Rose. And also Cindy Morris, our graduate coordinator, who's not here. Also in the acknowledgement should be all the friends and family who made today possible by supporting you, our students, and your research. I also want to thank my fellow faculty in the department. I know the amount of time and effort that you've put into these various research projects, into your senior seminars that were often the kind of birthplace of some of these papers. And I want to, above all, thank the students. We're really proud of the work that you've done. It's really sparkling, and I want sparkling. A history paper? Yeah, I think so. I think it actually fits. I mean, you're going to get a chance to hear some of that, all of you in the audience today, but I'd really encourage you to also read the papers if you're able. We can get them to you. We have ways of doing that, and the scholarship is really impressive. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to another person who really makes undergrad research possible in our department, Professor Kate Jones, who will introduce our speakers. Thanks, Kate.
All right, thank you all so much for being here. And I will say it really is one of the perks of being on the undergraduate committee is getting to read the papers at the end of the year and getting a sense of just the breadth of the research our students are doing. And I'll just add a little bit of a boast on your behalf. When we meet with all of the humanities departments to read each other's best papers to nominate them for other awards, people every time tell me the history papers were the best. So people read your papers, voluntarily and enjoy them. That's high praise. So I have the pleasure of just introducing people and their papers, and they're going to share with us little glimpses of the research, much of which is really deep and rich. So the first paper is coming from, or presentation is by Kussin-Gika. It comes from his paper entitled Kinderlach and Communists, or a comparison between Soviet ethnic policy and labor Zionism through the lens of the infamous JAO. Thanks.
Thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm sorry for the mouthful of a title of my paper. It's, when you have so many things you want to talk about, you just kind of put it all together. There is a place, it's called Russia. It's very big. In Russia, there is a place called the Jewish Autonomous Oblast. When I first found out about this, it confused the hell out of me, because why would there be a little section of this gigantic country like Russia dedicated to a very, very small group of people in the world, but also in Russia? So my thesis just sort of looks at the intersection of Soviet ethnic policy and labor Zionism, which was sort of the movement that said that the Ashkenazi Jewish people should have a homeland. It should be socialist in some respect. So I flew all the way out to Russia. I met with a bunch of people from this very frigid map. You can see this is the actual map of the oblast. Oblast in Russian translates roughly to province. It's in ice, and that's because when this picture was taken, it was anywhere between -14 and -24 degrees Fahrenheit out. I am from Los Angeles. That is freezing. All right, I point at the thing. This greeted me in my hotel room. Sorry, not my hotel room, in my hotel. It's a rabbi with his face cut out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Birbidjan, which is the capital city of the Jewish Autonomous Oblast. Basically, in the 1920s, the Soviet government had this idea, which was give all the major minorities, which is kind of a weird sentence, their own areas to govern. And a lot of them made a lot of sense. So, like, you have a group of people, I'm trying to think just off the top of my head, you have Volga Tatars in the Volga River region, so they get their own little state. You have people like Ukrainians, they end up getting their own little state. Belarusians, etc. And the Soviet government, being the Soviet government, was very good at splitting all these things down to a T. So, they gave one to the Jews. Why they gave it to them way out in the east of Russia, which is very far away from where Jews had specifically lived, that is what I'm going to talk to you about today. Thank you, Stephanie. Birbidjan is kind of a normal city in terms of it has buildings, it has blocks, it has public transportation. What's a little weird is that outside of Israel, you don't see so many menorahs all over this place. I mean, Birbidjan is a small city, menorahs everywhere, and that talks about the Jewish history in the region. So, when you talk about the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, and you talk about Russia's attitudes towards Jews in general, it's less of a religious issue and more of a social nationalistic issue. So this menorah is kind of a bad example because it happens to be in front of the new synagogue. One of the people that I spoke with, and I'll mention him later, is the rabbi for the region. So he graciously let me take pictures of all of his menorahs. Most of them did not end up in this slideshow because I had like 30 pictures. Yeah, so the region is established in 1928. Should I just not use this? Okay. The region was established in 1928. Joseph Stalin gave the land to a very vocal group of Soviet Jews that wanted to govern themselves in the tradition of other Soviet ethnic groups. They tried a whole bunch of different regions that made more sense sort of historically, geographically for the Ashkenazi Jews who had traditionally lived in the Pale of Settlement in the western side of Russia. For context, Birbidjan is closer to Los Angeles than it is to Moscow. This is very, very, very far away from Western Russia. Very far away. You can see, yeah. More menorahs. Can you do one more? This is the inside of a synagogue. The new synagogue. You can see that Birbidjan is a modern city with Jewish roots on account of all the Jewish imagery that we've seen in the inside of this little temple. Could you switch it? Thank you. But it is also a modern Russian city with a vibrant Orthodox and even a small Islamic population, Muslim population. There are churches all over the place. This is a little chapel in one of the parks. Could you do the next one? Thank you. This is another church sort of in sort of the lesser nice part of town. Yeah, so it shows you that this region isn't just a Jewish city, it's not just a Jewish region. In fact, it's very overwhelmingly Christian like the rest of Russia. Another interesting thing is how close it is to China. What would a Jewish city this close to China be doing? Ask the Soviets. There's a lot that goes into it. How much time do I have left?
7 minutes.
Okay, 6 minutes. The modern Russian attitude towards the Ashkenazi Jews in Birbidjan is they're just normal Russian citizens. Where you really sort of get into the meat, where you can really look at the city and say that this place is special on the world stage, one more, is when you look at its public art and the things that you can see just out and about. So this is a statue of Shalom Aleichem. If anyone has seen Fiddler on the Roof, you know about this person. He's a very famous Jewish playwright, very big Zionist, labor Zionist. A lot of Jewish life in Russia can be attributed to, or at least the way that people who are not part of that community, the way that people can look at this is through the lens of a lot of Shalom Aleichem's works. Thank you. One of the most interesting things about Azerbaijan being a Soviet satellite, or sorry, Soviet autonomous oblast, is that there's Yiddish everywhere on all the street signs. I don't know if you can really see, but like all this, that's Hebrew characters. That's not Russian. One of the first things that the Soviets wanted to do anytime that they set up these sort of autonomous regions for groups of people was get the linguistic freedom out there. So in a lot of countries, and especially a lot of empires, when you go into a region, first thing you do is tell the people they can't study their language anymore. Soviets had the opposite stance, which is, this is your region, you can govern it, it's part of the Soviet Union, so it's not actually like fully yours, but it's autonomous. You can practice your language, you can write street signs in your language, you can, what happened? So at a time in Azerbaijan, people actually spoke Yiddish, like as a first language. This is essentially unheard of. Now, especially, the language is basically dying, but even at the time of the establishment of the GAO in 1928, Yiddish is sort of this last vestule, if you will, of this sort of Ashkenazi Jewish identity that gets morphed throughout the Soviet era, and the last place that you can really see it is in Azerbaijan. No one speaks Yiddish anymore. Maybe like a couple people in their 80s, some of the people I interviewed can say like little phrases in Yiddish, but I can probably speak more Yiddish than they can. I speak very little Yiddish. And it's not just fancy signs like, you know, Shalom Aleichem Street is the big street in Azerbaijan. It's the Pacific Avenue. Every major street comes off of it. Every major store is on it. It's the downtown. So it kind of makes sense to have, like, you know, Shalom Aleichem Street in Yiddish in this Yiddish-speaking province. But they also have it for no smoking signs, and they also have it for this is at the entrance to a museum. So it's not just for show. I mean, people actually use these signs. Like I said, no one can read them, but they're still there. I think I have one more sign, or actually a couple more signs. Yeah, so this is Soviet Street, also written again in Yiddish. If you want to just keep going, then yeah, I think this is the last sign. All these pictures were taken on my phone, so I'm sorry for the quality. This is Pushkin Street. Every city in Russia, by law, not actually, but basically by law, has to have a Pushkin Street. So another thing that I talked about in my thesis is actually how, oh, sorry. This is a picture of me, my translator Gleb, and Vladimir Efimovich Fishman. He's the head of the Communist Party for Azerbaijan and sort of the greater GAO, which was not something that I was expecting to sort of walk right into, but I came face to face with Vladimir Lenin himself. Another thing I talk about in my thesis outside of just Azerbaijan and modern-day Russia is labor Zionism itself. Labor Zionism is kind of an interesting thing to look at because on the one hand, it's decisively socialist. On the other hand, it's decisively nationalist. These things tend not to mix, and they really don't mix in labor Zionism either. But the things, Jewish life in the Soviet Union, in this part of the Soviet Union, I'm talking the late 1920s, thank you, early 1930s, are really influenced by this desire by mostly Ashkenazi Jews living in Western Russia to have their own state, to govern themselves. The GAO was the Soviet Union's answer to that because they wanted to maintain the labor aspect of labor Zionism and get rid of the Zionism part of labor Zionism and just say, okay, you can govern yourselves as your own ethnicity, not your own religion. The Soviet Union is decisively against religion. Judaism is obviously a religion, but it's also an ethnicity, at least according in the eyes of the Soviets. Which is why you get things like Azerbaijan. It's also why you see an exodus of Jews from the Soviet Union, sort of following the 30s, on top of a bunch of other internal issues, is because they wanted to see themselves as more than just a group of people that could rule themselves within a larger societal framework and actually have a place where they can govern themselves. So Azerbaijan is sort of the Soviet answer to that, because Stalin, being Stalin, doesn't want a bunch of uppity Jews running around ruining stuff for him because he already killed a bunch of people in the 30s for being good doctors who also happen to be Jewish. So he puts them as far away from Moscow as possible on a little land that doesn't really have a lot. It's basically just a big swamp, and it's still kind of a big swamp even today. It's just a very cold, very big swamp. I have lost my train of thought. This is incredibly embarrassing. Can you go to the next slide? Thanks. Yeah, this is another one of the people that I worked with. This is the head rabbi from Birbidjan. My mom did him a bunch of scarves. He was very, very thankful. Yeah, I probably have, like 30 seconds left? Yeah. Okay. In these last 30 seconds, I just wanted to thank everyone in the history department, especially Maya Peterson, Bruce Thompson, my two translators that you saw. This is a little sign outside of my hotel. It says, well, it says Ya Heart, but it's Ya Lublul Birbidjan, so I love Birbidjan in Russian. Thought it'd be a good way to end this little slideshow. Yeah.
While the human clicker attempts to restore the mechanical one. So our next paper comes from Daphne Wright, or presentation. I should be clear, people are having to compress these really beautiful papers that are really rich in evidence and analysis into really short presentations, and that's always a challenge. So I applaud you all for doing that. So I keep referring to the papers, but they're not reading papers to us. But anyway, so Daphne Wright is up next. Her paper is entitled, the paper on which this presentation was based, is entitled Regional Modernity in Mid-Century Baghdad, Revisiting Frank Lloyd Wright's Plans for Greater Baghdad, Foundations of the University of Baghdad, and Rifat Chadirji's, you'll correct me, Influence in Iraqi Architecture. Thanks so much.
Hi, my name is Daphne Megarian-White, and today I will be presenting my research about regional modernity in mid-century Baghdad, and thank you for the introduction. So I researched and wrote this paper in Professor Junaid Sheikh's exit seminar, Urbanities in the Global South, and something, at first I kind of drafted out, and people tell you, write what you know, and with this research I really went into what I did not know. And I know that mainstream depictions of Baghdad in media in the US are very misconstrued, and so I really wanted to see what Baghdad meant over the 20th century to me. And so originally I tried to focus on more contemporary aspects of academic institutions and urban plans in Baghdad, but as I kind of got involved in the research, I realized that focusing on 20th century research would actually help me understand more contemporary developments. So I wanted to begin with a little brief political background to contextualize my research. So the urban planners who I focus on often reference the pre-modern layout of Baghdad when it was founded by the Caliph al-Mansur of the Abbasid Caliphate in the 8th century. And so the Caliph and his cohort chose this region because of its rich soil and also because it had strategic waterways which led across the Persian Gulf and to Egypt as the Islamic Empire was rapidly expanding. Throughout the mid-20th century period, during which the architects I researched created the urban plans for the city of Baghdad, Iraq was prospering as a post-colonial state, largely due to oil revenue. And despite many of the transitions in political leadership, the urban plans, especially focusing on the University of Baghdad, endured through these transitions. And so the period I focus on, the political transitions that are most important to my research were the fall of the Hashemite monarchy in the 14th of July Revolution in 1958. And during this coup, the royal family was actually assassinated because they refused to comply with the revolutionary leaders. And this led to the Prime Minister Abd al-Karim Qasim's rule under the Iraqi Republic from 1958 to 63. And this leads to eventually the Iraqi Republic's decline by 1968 as the Ba'ath Party came to power. And some of the contemporary aspects that I focus on, but I won't be discussing as much in this presentation, include security for students and faculty in the University of Baghdad in current settings, as well as the exodus of academics in the university and just in the academic world in general in Iraq, and also like gendered aspects of that are also focused on in my research. So my topic focused on concepts of authentic regional expression and national identity by examining the works of 3 architects who I'll be discussing later. Our exit seminar often discussed urban planning, and the word palimpsest was often used to describe the layers and traces of history that can be viewed as we examine an urban landscape and plans for an urban landscape in the case of my research. I also focused on education in my research for a few different reasons. One, this is a point of cultural pride in Baghdad, is their intellectual history. 2, because education relates to the philosophies of all of the urban planners that I researched. And 3rd of all, because my thesis actually argues for academic institutions to be prioritized in contemporary urban plans for the city. So Frank Lloyd Wright is the first architect who I focus on in my research. And at age 90, he was actually commissioned by King Faisal II to build an opera house in 1957. And this actually expanded into an entire cultural center plan in the inner core of Baghdad. And the plans were originally said to be a $45 million project within a longer 9-year billion-dollar public works project. And as you can see here, I have the term organic architecture, which is what Frank Lloyd Wright coined as his philosophy for architecture, which he explains as appropriate to time, to place, and to man. And this also has to do with the sense of harmony in architecture between the man and the world, which can also be further specified by geographic and cultural contexts and influences. So here we're going to look at the influences based on the 8th century Abbasid Caliphate. And on the right here, you can see the original foundation in the 8th century under the Abbasid Caliphate. And then you can see Wright's plans on the left. And this kind of shows the different references to the foundation during the founding, such as the concentric circle versus a grid system for infrastructure layouts, and the location between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and also the directional symbolism towards Mecca. So the second architect who I focus on in my research is Walter Gropius, and he, along with his firm, the Architects Collaborative, were commissioned to design the University of Baghdad, which would be just across the river from Wright's Opera House that was never realized. Although he was commissioned by his former student, Nizar Ali Jadat, this was actually the prime minister under the Hashemite monarchy, and so he continued his plans even after the coup d'etat with the revolutionary prime minister Qasim after 1958. So Gropius emphasized collaboration as a central philosophy in his work, as you can tell by his firm's name, the Architects Collaborative, and some researchers lend this to the fact that he had a bad hand for sketches for architectural design, but he claims that it also has to do with the interdisciplinary process of collaboration. And in a letter to his wife during the process of the university's designs, he explained how he met with the prime minister of the revolutionary government, and he was very excited about the amount of money he was granted for the project, and he even at the time believed he would be able to design the opera house after Frank Lloyd Wright died. And in the letter, he even mentioned to his wife that Frank Lloyd Wright will turn in his grave because he thought he would get to design the opera house. But he never did design the opera house. They're still trying to figure out who's going to do that. And so this is the designs for the University of Baghdad, and it was actually the state's largest cultural project at the time. And it had a lot of lodging facilities and other buildings just beyond just academic buildings. And here you can see the Prime Minister Qasim laying the foundation stone for the University of Baghdad. And in my research, I actually analyzed this as either a possible reference to or a tradition from historical accounts of the Caliph al-Mansur, who also is said to have laid a brick for the first foundation of the core of Baghdad in the 8th century. So the third architect who I focus on in my research to give kind of a bridge between before the Ba'ath Party rose to power is Rifat Chadirji, and he was raised in Baghdad but actually left to study architecture in London. And then in 1952, he founded his practice, the Iraq Consult, which he explained as an approach to design which combined Western technical advances and local vernacular forms. So this kind of focuses on the similar ideas of regional expression that Wright and Gropius do, but this comes from the perspective of someone raised in Iraq who better understands the post-war sociocultural situation there, but at the same time can discuss Western influences and avant-garde international styles that were prominent at the time since he was educated in the UK. So Chadirji is considered one of Iraq's most influential modern architects, and his book, Concepts and Influences Towards a Regionalized International Architecture, really helped me further understand these concepts of regionalized authenticity and regional expression in architectural design, and it was really interesting coming from this specific region. And one of his most influential pieces, the Abud building, which is built in 1955, is actually considered to be Baghdad's first high-rise, and this is a really important building in the city. And these are my references for my paper. It's super fun. And this is just the original photo I had on the first slide, too, which shows some of the projects for the Cultural Center. And so some of the more contemporary aspects that I focused on as I connected these different architectural designs and urban plans was kind of just focusing on how the government in contemporary settings should prioritize and commission education and prioritize the university in its developments. And like I said before, there was a large academic exodus even before the 2003 invasion due to sanctions in the 1990s. And so that's definitely something to be considered. And the gendered aspects of that also, as more women are working as faculty in the university, and the gendered terms of security in different environments. And yeah, it'll be very interesting to see. They still have plans for an opera house eventually. They had a new designer for it in 2011. And yeah, it's all very contingent, so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the coming years. And thank you so much. I want to thank Professor Juned Sheikh again and all of the faculty. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, everyone, for helping me with this project.
Thanks, Daphne. So our last presentation in this first part of the panel comes from Jason Gomez, and he's presenting based on his paper entitled Radio Revolution, Broadcast Propaganda Techniques During the Spanish Civil War. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming to the showcase today and for the opportunity to present to you. I wrote my paper for Professor Heckman's course, 194, Fascism and Anti-Fascism, the Global Spanish Civil War. I titled my paper, Radio Revolution, Broadcast Propaganda Techniques During the Spanish Civil War. And in it, I examined the weaponized uses of radio broadcasts within the Spanish Civil War. So today, I'm going to just briefly lay out some historical context, then give you my two main arguments, and just some other fascinating instances of radio propaganda. Oh, there we go. So this is a nice map. It shows the progression of nationalist forces throughout the years. So at the start of the quarter, I was actually pretty embarrassed about how little about the Spanish Civil War I knew. I'd been to the country several times before, and I still had no idea beyond there was a civil war in Spain, and some guy named Franco came out the leader. But that's more common than you think, so don't feel bad if you don't know about it. So it played a really important role in influencing geopolitics from then till now. I think it still does very much. And sadly in America, most people don't really know about it because it's sandwiched between two world wars, which everyone seems to love a lot more and study way more. So it's ignored in the curriculum. And this is the case in Spain as well. It's very much intentional, as that Franco had a very intentional campaign to kind of erase it and the atrocities of the Civil War from the history books. So they don't talk about it in Spain that much either, which is probably why I didn't know about it. So he wanted to get rid of anything that didn't fit his notions of Spanish greatness. And he did a pretty good job, honestly. So while no event is ever truly inevitable to a historian, I think that the events of the Spanish Civil War made the Second World War pretty much inevitable. So I like this map more personally, just kind of has a more ominous feel to it, and that's kind of the feel of the conflict. So some context, in the decades leading up to the Civil War, which lasted from 1936 to 1939, Spanish society was increasingly divided by numerous political ideologies, ineffectual governments, and pretty regular civil unrest. So by the summer of 1936, when the Spanish Republic, they'd already dealt with a few uprisings, so when Franco's forces finally attacked, no one expected the war of attrition that ensued. And over the next 3 years, the nationalist forces, with ample help from both Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, like a lot of support, basically bankrupted Italy. They slowly chipped away and negated the infrastructural advantages that the Republic had at the beginning of the war. And then in 1939, they were victorious, and Franco began a 35-year reign in Spain. So that's just a brief context. I encourage everyone to go do more research. There's a lot of interesting topics. But now, my two main arguments are, one, that radio broadcasting strategies played a pivotal role in radicalizing the Spanish people to violence and in shaping the outcome of the Civil War itself. It initially saved the Republican government by preventing the nationalist forces from achieving a decisive victory, but over time it became a protracted war, and that allowed nationalist broadcasts to slowly exploit the numerous political differences on the side of the left, the Republic, and that eventually fractured them. My second argument is that the radio strategies developed in the Spanish Civil War ushered propaganda into a modern era and are still very much prevalent today. I think you'll recognize a few of them. Oops, wrong way. So it's important to remember that the instantaneous and far-reaching capabilities of radio technology were revolutionary at the time. Like, we take that for granted now with all the different ways we can communicate in an instant. So you'd get a lot of scenes like this, where families would gather around the radio broadcasts each night. You can see all the generations. But they're the primary source of information for most Spaniards, and it's how they learned the most about the war each night. So families, friends, neighbors, they'd all gather around the radio set and tune in to the station, the frequency that resonated with their political opinions, and this helped to divide people even more. Unlike print media, though, the radio offered the ability to reach people regardless of their education level, location, socioeconomic status, and it really democratized information in a brand new way. It also brought the front lines and the violence into the homes and gave people little respite from the conflict, so it was very much, even if you weren't near the front, you felt like you were part of it a lot of the time. History and political scientist Benedict Anderson famously argues in his book Imagined Communities that the kinship of nationalist movements stems from a collectively imagined community. In my opinion, that applies to all communities, nationalist or otherwise. And these radio broadcasts serve to validate and strengthen that sense of unity and help turn those imagined communities into a concrete reality. So it really gives you a sense of community, even if you never meet them. Radio propaganda could be used to unify and embolden the community or to exploit suspicions and demoralize and divide it, which it was used both ways throughout the entire conflict. And it's that insidious nature that makes it capable of accomplishing military objectives that brute force alone could not. Oops, skipped a page, sorry about that. So both sides were well aware of having a strong presence on the airwaves, and they both strictly regulated access to and distribution of radios to people that they knew were loyal. And this poster is actually a propaganda poster about the radio, and it says, "The radio brings culture to the worker's home, respect its ownership, and promote its purchase." I just really love those that family there. If that's not blissful indoctrination, I don't really know what is. So this was by the Republican forces, probably an anarchist group because of the color scheme. But there's many posters like this promoting get the radio, get the information. And by associating it with class and culture, the propaganda ministries were also giving legitimacy to all the programming as well, regardless of its source. And this gave listeners a sense of moral superiority in a lot of cases. It reduced listener scrutiny because they just assumed it was coming from a good source, and that further polarized the audiences. Madrid is a perfect example of the radio being used as both as a tool for unity and division. For years, Madrid held out on nearly daily constant bombardments, and they gave hope to the remnants of the Republican zone, which, as you saw in the previous map, was slowly dwindling. And inspired by morale-boosting broadcasts like La Pasioria, Fascism Shall Not Pass speech, and these broadcasts instilled like the no pasaran spirit that came to embody the fight against fascism in Madrid, and they played them all the time. And people really got into it, and it brought people together. So like a scene like this is not uncommon, where it's clearly a war-torn and violent area, but everyone still seems to have decent spirits. But these broadcasts were also countered pretty equally by nationalist programs that sought to exploit and exacerbate differences among the political factions of the left. So here's a pretty good example of this is propaganda about one communist group not trusting another one, and then this is the no pasaran spirit, like bringing everyone together. So you have both sides being attacked and really highlighted via these broadcasts. Madrid was never actually captured by Franco's army, but what happened was its leaders were eventually deceived by the radio broadcasts. During the final months of the war, the nationalist station, Radio Nacional, professed Franco's desire and inclination for a peaceful armistice, and even outlined the details of the armistice for the people, and they just played this nonstop on their station. And eventually the leadership kind of started to believe it. The idea of a dignified end of the siege of Madrid kind of inflamed ideological differences and increased tensions. And so in February 1939, Colonel Casado and a faction of non-communist Republicans within the city's leadership actually they began their own rebellion against the communist forces within the city, and ended up that's how Madrid capitulated in the end, is they believed the broadcast and rebelled against themselves, which is tragic but true. But unfortunately for Casado and his compatriots, that couldn't have been farther from the truth. By the end of the war, Franco not only wanted total surrender, he wanted to wipe any signs of the Republic from Spanish society, and he began that process before the war had even ended. In the end, it was like that constant needling of the Radio Nacional broadcast that really brought Madrid down. So some other fascinating points that radio broadcasting was used was in 1936, the Republican government commissioned these big armored trucks. Oh, time's up, so I'll go to the conclusion. Both sides found that creating their own narrative was far from compelling, and countering the claims of the other side was more effective. One great case for this was Guernica, where these true story that the fascist forces didn't have any planes in the air is true, but the story that stuck was that communists dynamited it, and that actually still exists in Spain today. You can find people that believe it. So, speeding up, my research emphasized the necessity to view all forms of information through the historian's lens. What's the source? What's the context? Who's the intended audience? What's the bias? And always check your sources. Thank you.
All right, thank you all for those great presentations. And I think it's really striking that, I think these presentations really illustrate to us the value of historical research, both for helping us know about the past, but also possible futures that never really were fully realized. And so I really appreciate the diligence of the research and the suggestive analysis that you've provided in those papers. So at this stage, what we'd like to do is open this up to questions. And I think what I'll do is kind of help field things, and Stephanie will graciously move around with a microphone. So just so you know, the microphones are not amplifying sound. They're just part of the recording. So don't worry if you don't hear your voice booming out, but it will be recorded. And so I'm going to move this one over to the students. So, so anyone want to get us started with questions? Yeah. Do you want to start? Yeah. Sorry. No, Stephanie is already.
So my question is for Ian, so good that you got the microphone. So in your talk you mentioned that the Soviet government basically gave minorities areas to govern for themselves, and we see many instances of this in Central Asia and in Russia with numerous autonomous regions today, right? However, my understanding is that Birabirjan was kind of a failure. A lot of the Jews ended up not going there. So I'm curious if you yourself viewed it as a failure, and I guess where did it go wrong, right? Because a lot of the autonomous regions and republics that were created during the Soviet period still exist today, and they still speak their own respective languages. So, like, what happened in Birabirjan that made it not a success, as opposed to other places in the Soviet Union?
That is a loaded question.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. There were a whole bunch of reasons why Birabirjan and sort of the JAO experiment failed. The big ones usually, or at least the stuff that I talk about in my thesis when I'm talking about the reason why in the 1930s, like you said, the vast majority of the Jewish population left and stayed gone, had to do with sort of international affairs. So the 1930s, you start to see the rise of Hitler in Germany, anti-Semitism, which had always sort of been a thing in Europe and especially in Russia, sort of climbs again. I mentioned very briefly the doctor's plot, in which Joseph Stalin had a whole bunch of doctors in Moscow assassinated, the vast majority of whom were Jewish. There's some debate as to whether or not this was an overtly anti-Semitic thing that he did or if he was just paranoid. And I can tell you all about that some other time. But where it failed, I'd say that it starts to fail around the 1930s, when these people who moved there from Western Russia, from tiny villages, the vast majority of whom had never engaged in major agriculture, now they're on a collective farm. The vast majority of whom have never left Western Russia or even parts of Ukraine and Belarus and Poland. They're now way in the middle of an undeveloped, completely undeveloped landscape with swamps and hills and trees. And, you know, the first couple of years, agriculture failed almost entirely. People died from disease. People died from starvation. That is not what you want to put on a postcard to get people to move somewhere. And then as the sort of 20th century keeps clicking along, 1948, you have the establishment of Israel. A lot of Jews leave from the Soviet Union for the region. A lot of them leave for other areas. Birabirjan and the JAO was no different. The vast majority of the Jewish population that moved there did not stay. Most of them ended up moving outside of the country. Many of them moved back to their original settlements in the West. Jewish population has never recovered, probably will never recover. So yeah.
So thanks, everybody. I just wanted to second what Kate was saying. You really took us on an amazing journey in time and also, of course, in places and cultures. And I was wondering, this is really a question open to anyone on the panel or out of the papers that were presented. Could you talk a little bit about your journey as researchers, like encountering sources? What were some of the aha moments for you? How did you come across your sources? Roadblocks, too? Because I know there's a lot of other undergrads in the room, and I'm sure they'd be interested in hearing about that as well.
What do you guys want to go first?
Sure. So I guess, you know, the typical, like, you started large process and then went small. That's essentially every historian's path on research. But for me, the aha moment was finding, like, a really obscure Spanish telecommunications journal and just reading an article that had luckily been translated. And it was like oh wow, this is it opened up a whole opportunity of research I didn't even know had been a possibility. So I mean, just keep digging as eventually, and you'll find something you're interested in. That history is full of little things that everyone's interested in, so yeah.
Anyone else?
I would say biggest barrier is the linguistic barrier. Being an American who's monolingual and only speaks English restricts a lot of your research just in the world in general. And so I was a little intimidated when I decided to do a topic that would be focusing on Iraq and specifically Baghdad. But especially regarding primary sources, I think it's kind of a chain of events. Once you find one great primary source, it kind of leads you to another. And also just don't underestimate the power of a really great image, because those really helped me as I went along my research as well.
One of the things that that I really wanted to talk about in my thesis and ended up not giving it as much credit as I think it should have was this idea of displacement amongst various people, Jews and non-Jews, in the far eastern portion of Russia. I didn't really find a lot of stuff I could work with. So in my search for research, so that's basically an entire third of a thesis that I wanted to write that didn't get a lot of credence paid to it. So, just be prepared that sometimes things that you want to write about won't end up coming to fruition. On the other hand, my sort of aha moment was I was lucky enough to actually go to Eastern Russia. The IHR and Nathaniel Deutsch, who I don't think is here, they graciously gave me a lot of money and I got on a plane. So my aha moment for working in a topic that doesn't have a lot of pre-existing research was actually being able to go there. And similar to the linguistic issue, I speak a little bit of Russian. I'm not fluent in Russian. If you drop me in the middle of Russia, I would have an okay time getting around, but it wouldn't be the best experience. So don't be afraid to take on things that are understudied, because it just might mean that you get to go there and study it yourself.
Hi, this is for Jason. I was just wondering how you compare the radio use in the Spanish Civil War to the use for the Hutus and Tutsis in the Rwandan genocide, because I know that it's highly likely that radio broadcasts incited a lot of violence.
I'm not being super familiar with the way that the radio is used in that conflict, but I think it really comes down to radio's ability to really divide people, even if it's not based on facts. Like, if you are listening to the radio all the time and there's a constant voice, like maybe a big personality. Part of my research was about how the airwaves were taken over by big personalities really quickly. So if you have that personality that's telling you every day what to think, or that these people are different or bad, eventually it's going to cause violence and separate people farther and farther apart until it's too late, So I think that probably would be the same thing that happened there. And I think whether it's radio, television, any medium, or print media before to an extent as well, can be used to divide people if you're not conscious of where it's coming from or what the intention is. And I think that happens far more than we like to think. And that's the end result in the most extreme form.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. So, because we're a little bit behind schedule, we're going to take just about 5 minutes. So if people want to come, if you have additional questions for our panelists, please come up and ask them. I know I had a long list, so I might pigeonhole you and try to get you. In any event, but there's snacks and there are your colleagues and professors here, so come and say hello. And then we'll be returning and getting to hear a presentation by Joe Gavin, and who will correct me on the pronunciation of his name, I hope. Gavin, great. Who's going to talk about his experience taking the history major out into the world. So especially those of you who are undergraduates here, it's a great opportunity to think about what you do with a history major. We're delighted he's here to join us. So we'll take just a few minutes and we'll return. But if you would join me in giving a hand